All the gardeners, all the members, welcome. Yes, I have worked for many, many years as a landscaper. I decided very early on when I came to Canada that working in the office was not for me. So after a quick stint in Vancouver in the landscape architect's office, I came to Victoria, saw the sunshine, and I said, this is for me. I started very strangely as working in the Oak Bay Beach Hotel. And there was a lady gardener there. My name is Anna Maria. Her name was Marianne. Somehow we got mixed up. The good part is I ended up inheriting her business. After a year, she traveled away to Europe, and that was that. And I never looked back. I was never a very good gardener when I was a kid and a young person. I was not interested. But I've always drawn. I've always tinkered and sketched. And so at some point in my life, I decided that I have to decide where am I going to university. And I discovered landscape architecture. I thought, okay, biology, yes. Art, yes. All the boxes ticked. But I'm finding that most people do not really know what landscape architect does in practical terms. I would say even architects here don't really know how to use us. They think the best is that they draw the concept plan and I just put the names of the plants in. Well, not quite. The landscape architecture in Europe is used much more extensively. We're very much a part, particularly at the beginning of the project. We're one of the bigger components of that project because we decide about the ecology, about the climate, about the elevations, about the different structures required, drainage, soils, and everything. And the same applies to designing in a garden. You have to start at the beginning with the lay of the land, soil, with the drainage, with where the water comes from, where the water goes out, the very basics. And this is what I do when I come to your garden and you ask me, oh my goodness, what shall I do with this? I take it on board and I explain what needs to be done to achieve what you want to get out of your garden. I think quite often we get caught up in magazine pictures and we want to have this wonderful garden despite what we actually have in terms of land and its layout. This is why I thought it would be a nice introduction to landscape design, just for every gardener to look at your place. If you want to change it, that you need to start at the very beginning. One of the main components of the project is functionality. What do you really want from your garden? How does this land is supposed to fill you with joy and pleasure? We know how to grow things as gardeners, but we also have to know where to grow and what to grow. And the basic component being soil and water and elevation is what determines it. I can design a garden that is completely different from the land that is sitting on, but I can't say I enjoy that. I think it's much more fun working with the land rather than against it. Working against the land costs more. It's simple as that. You have to engage too many technical parts, too many architectural, cement, building walls, and that quite often can be avoided. And over the years, that's my experience, that it's much easier to work with the land. The plants that grow there will support a certain type of planting material introduced. So we have to pay attention to it. If we rip everything out, we're also taking away all the natural bacteria and fungi and all that richness that evolved over the millions of years to support the plants that are there. In the last years, we've started thinking about ecology much more and the climate. And people came with the concept of xeriscaping. I think it's quite often misunderstood. It doesn't mean that you don't do anything. You still have to support the plants with water and proper compost and such. But at least it's a step in the right direction of using the natural way of growing our plants and helping them be the best that they can be. I imagine that this lecture would not be just a lecture. I would love to hear your questions. Now, I have printed some material to give you a sort of an overall picture of what I do. I should have printed about 50 more. So we'll probably have it on the website within a week or two for those of you that want to access it and print it. Over the years, I have worked in Victoria mostly, but I've also worked here in Sooke. And one of the gardens that I was involved with was the Sooke Physiotherapy little mall where the Vienna Cafe used to be. And that little garden on the corner was designed for the owners of that mall, and that was a lot of fun. But I've also worked with clients from a very, very varied background, including Vice President of Exxon during the catastrophe, almost acre and a half of waterfront in Victoria, a lot of money, not as much joy. I've also worked with a beautiful garden in Fairfield, which evolved and is still carried on by the new owners, where we had to design the garden that would fit the existing house, which was from the middle 1900s. So I've done some research and found components that would be present at that time. And one of them was an absolutely beautiful river rock wall that exists to this day, 120 odd feet of it. And I have to say, because the people who lived at that time in that house had an appreciation for history and the gardening. It was one of the best projects that I've done and gave me many years of joy. But I've also done a project for a lady who grew up in Kuwait and Egypt and wanted to have something in her garden that would remind her of that climate. And that's the most colorful garden I've ever designed. And it was a lot of fun. And I was let loose, and that's always very, very enticing. When we approach a project, I think it's never a bad thing to ask questions. It doesn't have to be landscape architect. It can be a gardener that you know. It can be a friend that you know. Because every one of us, every gardener, has experience. And why not use it? We all learn something from other people. I've been at it for almost 40 years, and I will never say that I know everything. Absolutely not. Because I learn every day from you guys. Somebody comes up with something brilliant, a plant that I always thought that shouldn't be growing where it is, it's growing and it's happy. Ask questions. Be curious. But also remember how you use your garden, how you use the space. And that's probably one of the very first things that I do is when I approach a new project, is I ask the person to explain to me how they use the space, how they walk through the garden, how they walk through the space between the gate and the front door, how the garden looks to them from the inside. What are they planning to be doing in the garden? Some people want to use it as an open field so the kids can play. This is what determines the function of the garden, is what's happening in our life. So pay attention to it. If we design a garden that's only based on beautiful pictures in the magazine, that's not our garden. Because it really is not what we do there. Garden, as you all well know, because you're gardeners, is to be in, hands in, to be used, abused, making mistakes, and learning from it. But also to create a space where you have your little corners of peace and quiet, where you can sit down under your favorite tree. So you put a beautiful bench to listen to the sound of water, to be able to have a party. So function is extremely important. And there's no such thing as a wrong way of using garden. If you're using it in a certain way, that's the way it is. And you should follow it. Follow your heart, follow your joy, follow how you walk through it. Now, a lot of times, if we don't ask questions, then we don't learn how to do things easier, how to fight a certain drainage problem. If you can't figure it out, take a picture. We have the technology now that you can have it on your phone. Come and ask us. Go to your garden club and ask several people, what would you do? It doesn't always have to be somebody calling themselves a designer. I think it's wonderful that we all are designers. If we're using the garden and changing it, we're redesigning it. And that's the most beautiful part of the whole job. I would love to hear people asking me questions. Raise your hand, and maybe we'll start the question and answer period. Nope.
Wondering if the views on lawns have changed.
Views on the lawns have changed somewhat. We're trying, because of the change in the climate, particularly in the south end of Vancouver Island, which is considered Mediterranean climate, prolonged droughts in the summer and a lot of heat. We're using a lot of different mixes now, including stuff like that before we would never even look at. It's a bit of a hit and miss, as you all know. I think the biggest difference is lawn is a extremely high water use, and you can't really get away from it. You can limit it somewhat by change of the mix, but if you want to have a lawn, then unfortunately you have to water it regularly, you have to aerate it, you have to add new soil or sand. If you look at the golf courses, it's never ending. It's also a very expensive proposition, but lawn has its function. When you have kids, animals, or yourself, and you like running around, you have to have a surface to run on them. So sometimes it's a question of finding maybe a cheaper way of taking care of it. My suggestion is always go back to the basics, which is feed the lawn in the most organic, green way possible. There are fertilizers that are used, and I have used over the years. One of them is called Sustain, and it's a granular turkey manure. And it is available. It is not as expensive, and best of all, because the numbers, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, are low, it's absorbed at excellent rate, and it does not create overfeeding with nitrogen. A lot of commercial fertilizers have very high numbers, which means that it pushes the grass to grow extremely fast, and the grass exhausts itself. So you have to keep on feeding. That ends up in our groundwater, that amount of chemicals. So the trend is to go into much lower numbers, more organic approach. And honestly, in my own garden, when I had a lawn, I never fertilized it. I mulched the grass right into the lawn. End of story. Natural fertilizer, natural source of nitrogen. You don't have to fertilize the out of it. So in other cultures, like in England, on larger estates, of course, people use meadows. meaning natural mixture of annuals, perennials, and grasses. And you only mow a part of it that you're using, and the rest takes care of itself. It also creates, if you're not mowing it continuously and very low, then the grass, the height of the grass shades the soil and shades the grass, which means you don't have to water it as much. Most of the lawns in Victoria are horrendously mowed to the ground. And people wonder why the lawn looks the way it does in the summer. It's dead because there's nothing left between the fertilizing and cutting to an inch of its life. It's just not going to be good. So the general trend, which is really hopeful, is that we're admitting that Mother Nature does a much better job than we do, and we have done, and just follow it. You know, use as natural way of taking care of your garden as possible. So that translates from the lawn to your shrub and perennial beds. Mulching, 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 mulching forever. It doesn't matter really what material you use. You can rejuvenate your shrub beds and your perennial beds by just even using your lawn cuttings. It's a mulch. It disintegrates very quickly and provides the insulation from heat, keeps the water down, and feeds it. Leaves that so many of gardeners or garden owners pack in bags and take away, I just shake my head. Why? Aesthetically, we were used to a different cultural norm, granted. And manicured lawns and manicured beds were the way to go. But I think we know better now. So, highly recommend natural feeding, natural mulching, following the Mother Nature. It's going to be cheaper, easier on your back, and easier on your pocket. But lawns can be done, as I said, if you cut it a little bit longer and just mulch instead of bagging it. Just run it over a couple of times and mulch it right in. That's all you need. It works. Yeah, now and again you might have to aerate it and top it up. Absolutely. In Portland, Oregon, due to the problems with bees, with pollinators, or lack of them, and lack of the food, they have been running this program which encourages people not to cut the lawn until almost mid-April, May. The reason being is dandelions that we all remove so happily because they annoy us are one of the first flowers after winter that open up for the bees to feed on. And we forget that part. We're having monoculture of lawn, monoculture of shrubs, monocultures of our perennial beds, or very limited varieties. Pardon me? There you go. Now, Brits, of course, being Brits, have developed and introduced actually hybridized dandelions with different color foliage that seed readily. Now I'm yet to see that in Victoria, but there is a thought. Dandelion is very good for you, and good for the bees. So that's basically, yeah, Mother Nature, and instead of stepping away from heavy control of the environment is, I think, the way the gardening is going. It's encouraging because it's less work, less water usage, healthier for everyone, less, pesticides and herbicides and who knows what in groundwater and on our hands and on our kids' hands. Thank you for the question. The fertilizer I used is called Sustain. I think it's spelled Sustane. It is available through the commercial supplier, Agrico, or what are they calling themselves nowadays? They're on, in Victoria of between Douglas and Gorge. There's a little street that runs across. Just as you turn off Burnside, before the bus depot, there's a little street. And you can go there and you can buy 40-pound bag for about $50. Pardon me? They've changed their name several times. Between the Gorge and Douglas, there's a little street just before the bus depot. I think they might call themselves Nutri something or other. If you Google, pardon me? No, it starts with G. Garbally Road. There you go. Garbali Road. Sort of right in the middle of it, going towards Gorge on the right-hand side, you'll see big bags of peat moss and typical landscape supplies. Function of the garden is determined by what you do in it. So the client, you as a garden owner, have to determine or just follow how you use the garden. I was taught at the very, very beginning of my studies that one of the best ways of determine where to put the pathways is to leave the bloody garden alone and start walking. And after a year, you make your pathways. It's very simple, because we're creatures of habit, and we also go from point A to point B, usually in a straight line. So why fight it? I mean, yes, you can create beautiful rooms in the garden. That's slightly different. But basically, how we walk determines where the paths should go. Not that you put the path first, and then you decide, now I have 2 heavy bags of groceries, and I have to go 50 feet around. I don't think so. Yes?
Think about the arteries that come off my heart. They're big, the ones that come out of the house, and then they get smaller when they go to the smaller places. And all of the turns are like I could ride my bicycle on it if it's a big artery.
Yes, so that's the function that determines. And if let's say you just bought a new house with a new garden, it's brand new development, there's diddly squat in it, or somebody else's idea, So there's a couple of trees and lawn. Leave it and start walking, because you will know, the wider you walk, that's the primary connection. So that pathway will be the most used, should be probably the widest. All the secondary ones will show off. So follow them, because this is how you use the space. Now we can, of course, change the function, but that gets a little bit more complicated. It gets determined quite often by the structures that we want in our garden. So the original pathway, if it doesn't go to our brand new garden shed, we'll have to change that. We'll have to connect it. But particularly in the larger properties and properties in Sooke, where you had to really demolish most of the ground and start all over again, that idea of walking through the space is probably one of the easiest to determine how, not only how to get from point A to point B to whatever structures, but also that between those pathways, that's where your beds are going to be.
My pathways are determined by the deer that go through my yard.
If that's the function of your garden, good for you. Now, that is funny, but actually not. Because that, let's say if we are trying to grow hydrangeas in our garden, and we don't want to put a fence, you can actually determine how to block the deer from coming through your property, or how to divert them. So you can put across their pathway plants, for example, big rosemary. Deer do not eat rosemary. Mixture of shrubs. Divert them to the area a little bit further out from your hydrangeas or roses or whatever. So watching how the wildlife moves through your garden also will determine where you put the most beautiful flowering plants that support the bees and the birds and everything else. So function to me has always been a very important part of garden design, because we function in the garden. Any other questions?
Have you ever come across a situation where you've got natural elements that can't be changed, that cause difficult problems for you, and how you go about it?
Could you repeat the question, please? So we can hear it.
How do I deal with an instance where we have existing elements in the garden, be it shrubs or trees or natural plants or rocks, and how do you deal with that if you cannot remove it? If the big boulder is right in the middle of your driveway, you have to move it, you have to blast it or whatever. There is not always a possibility of actually going around it. I had to do it on my property. It created a difficulty for the larger vehicles, but sometimes that's just the way it goes. And when we put our driveway up to our house, the proper driveway, that's what we had to deal with, because there was no other way of having the proper grade to come to the house, which means accessibility. And we had to go around the massive Mama Earth. Over the years, it's one of the most beautiful features of my driveway because it's about 30 feet high rock with moss in it. Eventually, the blackberries found their way there. I don't ever water them. They're just there. This size, massive, beautiful. And I have learned to live with it, and the garden has developed around it. So sometimes, I guess that's where the sort of a need for control will be. Is if you're faced with something that is there and it's not moving, then you have to find a way around it. And it might make for an absolutely gorgeous feature in your garden. So my advice will always be, don't look at something with anger. Don't get frustrated. Step back and see if it can be used. If you can't move it and remove it, maybe you can use it and create something beautiful from it.
When I moved into my house about 25 years ago, I had an ugly rock wall by my back door, and the whole length of the house, and probably about 8 feet tall. Ugly, ugly. I hated it, wanted to plant little things in it, but I left it because it wasn't the priority. And now, this time of the year, there are such a variety of lichen and mosses growing on it. It's just gorgeous for a winter feature.
So this is what happens when we learn something that gardeners are not known for, meaning patience. We live in a part of the world where Mother Nature provides, if we can only open our eyes and agree that maybe we should be looking at it from a different point of view rather than conquering it. Maybe we can learn to coexist with it and use it to our advantage. New methods of gardening allow us now to do xeriscaping, to plant between the native plants. And we're learning that it can be done, that we don't have to rip everything out that's native and spend hundreds and thousands of dollars for something that's never lived here and we're going to be fighting to keep it alive, that we can step back and maybe compromise a little.
Have you designed any spaces that include labyrinths? And if you have, do you have any thoughts on sort of best practices or best spaces for those?
Labyrinths?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
It's a interesting concept, labyrinth. Labyrinth is basically hedge, convoluted hedge. So if you look at it that way, you can draw it on a piece of paper and translate it by using, for example, pegs and string. And then you plant whichever material you would like used for your labyrinth. Now we know that boxwood is used, yew, shrubs, but you can also use large grasses, which would be absolutely stunning. And also in winter, late winter, you can cut them down and actually see where you are. So whichever material you choose, you have to design it accordingly to when it comes to the width of the paths. You have to check really how that plant that you've chosen, how it grows, and to provide enough space for the plants, the path, and then the next hedge. But yeah, I didn't have that chance. Maybe still. Who is first? I'll get to you in a moment.
As most of us know, there's a trend toward native rewilding yards and native plantings. I imagine you're deep into it. Are you able to incorporate it into your actual work, or you have to only respond to a customer? Because it seems to be so much more beneficial for the insects and bees that are in trouble.
I absolutely always try to talk into more organic, more natural use of planting material. There is a wee bit of a problem with plant material that quite often is recommended for rewilding because people use it inappropriately. For example, shallow, Oregon grape, salmonberry, and so forth, they're all really invasive. And they're invasive. They are plants that spread. And yet, a lot of nurseries will sell them as native plant. You should plant it in your garden. Well, if you plant a salmonberry in your garden, not a good idea, because you're going to be fighting and ripping the roots. It spreads several feet every year. So you have to be aware of the habits of those plants. Now, Oregon grape is also invasive in terms that it spreads. There's two different types, the tall one and the short one. It can be used, the tall one particularly, fairly easily because you can contain it. You can also prune it. You can bush it up. But people use things like shallow as a ground cover, and they want it to stay short and cute. If you have an area that can be naturalized, which means is contained or borders with the wilderness, go for it, no problem. But if you try to use it in a city lot, in a bed that's 4x4, you're out for trouble. So again, this is just common sense. Absolutely use as many natural plants, native plants to this area, but they have to be used appropriately. Now, trying to think what else have I come across that people used, and then I was ripping it out. Yep. In town, city lot, curly willow, in 30 years was 60 feet high and swallowing the house and ripping the foundations. Because somebody thought that was such a cute idea to put that little curly willow. Again, whenever you're buying a plant that you don't know about, do absolute deep research. Not just what the tag says, because those tags in the nursery, I worked for many years at Gardenworks in the nursery. These tags are written by people who know how big the plant will grow in about 10 years. And they're not always gardeners, and they're not always right. So always check, read it, check the name, check Latin name, go online. We have the technology. Get your knowledge, because that's going to be great benefit to you. I love using native plants. I have on my property, I have no fences. I love deer. They waltz through. And what I found over the years is that the more variety of shrubs and plants you have, the less trouble. If you have one of something in your garden and you have deer, they're going to go for it. That's just how it works. Because they're grazers. That doesn't mean that they particularly want to destroy that particular plant. But if there's nothing else for them to graze on, that's what happens. I think at the farm on Blenkinsop, I think they're called Madrona. It's a lovely organic farm. They have used the method of discouraging deer from eating their plants by creating walkthroughs for deer with a lot of native plants, a lot of shrubbery, a lot of perennials. So it's easier than to create a limited or contained area by those grazing hedges for deer to just stop at the hedge, because they have a lot of excellent material to feed on. Most deer in town are not very healthy because they're eating crud that we provide, and it's not good for them. When I compare the size of the deer that is in front of my house with what's in town, they're half the size in town. So introducing native plants amongst all your other stuff, the more varieties you have, the easier it is to control the damage. Because I don't notice if they eat something amongst hundreds of other things. And besides, deer have a pea brain. Really, we can't outsmart them?
I wonder if you ever use drones to take pictures and then use those pictures on the computer for doing design.
No. I can see how landscape architects probably already do that. I grew up sketching by hand all my plans. Eventually, I have learned to use CAD, computer-assisted drawing. Even before I knew Windows, drove my instructor crazy. But I have nothing against technology, absolutely. If it's helpful, particularly in this area where a lot of our properties are really large, yes, find out from up above what, how, because you will see a lot of interesting things. You will see how the land is visible, what's the coverage of the plant material on it, where are the really dry spots, where there is, for example, rainwater damage in winter. So why not use it? Just don't know your neighbors. But yeah, if you need to assess your property, absolutely use the technology. It's there to be used.
with climate change, is there a changing view of maintaining more wetlands in swampy areas?
Absolutely. I watch, the question was, do we pay attention to the wetlands considering climate change? Now, we as gardeners, we do. The developers are not. Look at the Bear Mountain. Look at the West Hills. It's criminal what they've done. And our politicians have a great gab about climate change and how we should take part and fight it, and yet they are allowing hundreds of millions of acres of trees being removed. They forget that if you don't have trees on the rock, you don't have clouds, you don't have shade. We all know how it feels going from the pavement to the forest. The difference in temperature is 20 degrees. Why do we expect the Mother Earth to stay cool when we remove the coverage? A lot of countries have been doing things where they're using rooftops. I just recently watched a program about Singapore. Unbelievably high density, very, very high buildings. They're growing food on top of those buildings, and with great success. Hydroponically, up on top, full use of rooftops. We can be doing the same thing here. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's trying to encourage new homeowners when they're building the house to, for example, put the green roof on top. Why not? Insulating properties, temperature-wise, and, a beautiful addition of breathing live material on top of your house. It used to be said that it's so expensive. I beg to differ. Because if you're putting a green mass of native plants on top, which are beautiful, yes, you have a cost of the membrane, but nowadays, if you checked recently the price of the roofing, it's horrendous. And it's useless, and it heats up. And we have to put the insulation underneath to keep the house from heating up. It just doesn't make any sense. So the climate change, I think, is intimidating when the politicians talk about it, because they don't offer us practical little solution that we can control within our own life. I highly encourage everyone to look around your house, your garden, and see if you can improve things. If there is, let's say, right now I'm working on a garden where somebody loved the idea because they saw it in the magazine of this beautiful river rock covering all the beds underneath the trees. The result is the soil is compacted, dead underneath it. Weeding those river rocks is a nightmare. Anybody who worked in a garden that has river rock as a mulch, there is a place for things like gravel and such in the garden, of course. But we have to start thinking about the temperature difference. I will always recommend nowadays using natural things like bark mulch and wood chips rather than rock, because rock heats up. So rock with rhodos not a good idea. Rhodos have shallow root system, which does not like to get heated up. Right, so there are places for it. Gravel, fantastic on pathways, cleans your shoes. In the garden, Brits use a lot of pea gravel, but they also have lots of rain. So, everything for its own use. Be observant, watch Mother Nature, and quite often you get the answer just looking around.
Another question? You want to just scratch it? Are we done? Yeah.
Okay. Lovely talking to you. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, Anna. And here's a little gift for you. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to the raffle.